Welcome to the Melanin Private Practice Group podcast with your host, Lynn. In this podcast, we focus on providing helpful information to new and existing mental health practitioners interested in starting a private practice and or those who are currently in it but just need a little bit of help. If you are ready to receive this word, let's dive in. Here we go.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning into another series of the Melanin Private Practice Collective podcast. I'm your host, Lynn, and I'm super excited to be coming to you this morning for another powerful season of what we're calling the Leadership Series. So today's episode, we're going to be talking about what is congruence and why your teams can't succeed without it. But before we dive into that, I want to first give you some context as to why we chose this topic. So I've been in the healthcare industry now for 18 years as of May 10th, 2025. And as a healthcare administrator and now a healthcare executive, I have to tell you that I've seen almost everything that you could possibly think of, although I'm pretty sure within healthcare, you can't make stuff up. And there's a lot more that I'll be exposed to and will have stories for days on. But one thing that I have found, whether it was working in private practice, for medical groups, hospital systems, pharma, medical device, rehabilitation, no matter what, no matter where I went, all of the problems that were happening inside of a business always went back to the leader. And what I mean, it always went back to the leader. I'm strictly focusing on how leaders handled the problems that were presented to them. As leaders, it's not just the authority that we have that makes us successful. Okay, authority is just what it sounds like. The power is given to them to make certain decisions and to lead. But leadership is much deeper. It focuses on guiding the strategies and the people who are supposed to implement and execute on those strategies. We provide clarity, connection, and character development. Everything we do affects not only the organization, but the people who drive the success of the organization, the clients we serve, and the patient population that surrounds our businesses. As leaders, it is our job to make sure that we're doing everything in the best interests of others. Many people don't think like that. Many people move with the benefit of self. And so when we are driving these conversations, our goal is to move behavioral health practices from functional businesses to well-centered ecosystems where staff come in and they're not coming into chaos or stress or environments filled with jealousy and envy and all of those that encompass the negative side of business. We're driving wellness center, people who have excellent communication skills. And if they don't have it, we're helping them improve those communication skills. We're driving success and implementation. We're teaching people how to be involved in the planning process and how to see things from other lenses and be able to think outside the box and be able to effectively deliver their work. We're looking at the character development. How did they first come to us? Where is it they want to go? What areas do they want to improve? And how do we shape that through the work that they're doing? How do we connect them to training and resources and other exposures to associations that can help them grow beyond where they are? That is what we do. That is what a great leader does. And so when I would take different contracts and I would go into these different entities and I would perform whatever recovery I was hired to perform, I often would witness leaders use the blame game, or there would be favoritism. So even if the person they liked did something wrong, they would never address it, which caused friction between the teams and the dynamics of how people worked together. And God forbid you have an attitude. Don't have an attitude, because then they just left you and sent you packing with your stuff and replaced you within a month or so. And so I would witness this over and over and over and over again. And when I decided to create JLW Medical Management Consulting, the initial goal was to put a plug in having to repeatedly go into these organizations and fix the problem. I said, well, if I can educate you before it happens, maybe, just maybe, you won't make the same mistakes. But life turned out that working with startups wasn't my to go. I wanted to work with existing businesses that had already made the mistakes and had already unplugged what needed to be plugged. They'd already made decisions that put them in a not so good place or caused friction within the team dynamics. And the reason I shifted from startup to existing was because oftentimes it would be the existing practices that had the most risk. And if we could stop the bleed before it got worse, it would help us to help them not make those same mistakes again. Because the reality was, a lot of people were going to start without the foundations. So rather than chase the startups that have already made, or to stop them from making the mistakes, we're going to get the existing businesses who see the effects of their decisions and who are ready to actually address those problems and learn from those problems with the right tools, tips, and information. So we made a pivot to existing businesses, although we will still technically consult startups. We just have more services available for existing practices. So that's why we developed the leadership series. We wanted to make sure that people understood that leadership is not just about a fancy title. It's not about getting to say, well, you own your own practice now. It's not about having authority and being able to be the boss. It is about making sure that you're leading your practice in the right direction, which also goes back to having a business plan. Now, I've heard many people say that you don't technically need a business plan to start your business. I don't agree with that. I look at a business plan like a living will. For those of you who don't know what a living will is a directive that in the event that you should become incapacitated or disabled or whatever the case may be, the living will gives instructions on how you want to see things handled, from your healthcare decisions all the way down to your business, who takes over your business decisions, your daily operations, so on and so forth, to your finances and how your finances are managed. That is what a living will is. In the same way, a business plan is the living document that provides direction for the company. It provides instructions for human resources, instructions for operations, instructions for sales and marketing and finance. It is the blueprint for how you are going to be successful. And then alongside of your business plan, you have strategic action plans. And your strategic action plans should outline how you're going to accomplish everything that you've listed in your business plan. And year over year, when you're evaluating your business plan, whether on a quarterly basis or an annual basis. Some even evaluate it on a monthly, although I don't personally recommend monthly. Over time, you are looking at what did and did not work. You're comparing those business plans to your strategic action plans, and you're finding the comparisons or the trends or the patterns of what you did. So essentially, they are records for everything you do from the start to the closure of your business. And the reason that's important is because when we think about creating congruent businesses, businesses that are thriving, that are aligned, that are healthy, we think about the daily decisions that we make. And I want to give you a quick example of how incongruence can creep in when we don't plan for inevitables. So many years ago, 17 years ago to be exact, I worked for an answering service. And this particular answering service had two locations. It had the location near Worcester and the location near Boston. And at the time, I was a supervisor and I worked on the overnight shift. And I had taken a call from a patient who had made some pretty disturbing comments, and so much so that I thought that they were in crisis and intervention was needed immediately. Now, inside my particular answering service, we had a system, and the system had one card that had the company address, contact information. So when you answered a call, you knew what practice you were answering for and had all the available immediate information available. Then you might have another card, and this was the entry form for how you entered the information to get transmitted to the doctor's office or the doctor or the on-call specialist. And then we have what we called a policy card. So the policy card focused on the instructions for how the practice wants you to handle specific situations. So after 7 o'clock, that's when the on-call took over. And the on-call would basically be available for any emergencies. In this particular practice, they had 3 on-calls. Well, let me rephrase that. They had one main on-call, the person who was in charge for the day, but then they had backups. So 3 other personnel that were served as backups. So there was 4 people altogether. And on this particular night, when we got the call, the patient expressed what they expressed, so we followed the protocol. You call the first on-call person, wait 30 minutes, no call, send an email plus call, and then another 30 minutes. If still no response, send a text and a call and an email. And you did this repeatedly. And then if you completed one full cycle, there was still no answer, you moved to the second person on call. And then if there was still no answer after 15 minutes, you went to the third person on call. And if there was still no answer after 15 minutes, you went to the fourth person on call. So I made about 25 calls to each on-call person across the entire practice. And eventually, I had to get the patient off the phone. Despite what they had said, I had to find a way to transfer this patient without allowing their elapsed time for what the patient said that they were going to do, whether it was true or not. So the patient, during the time of keeping them on the call, had told me about a park that they grew up around and had later stated in statements that they lived around that park currently. And so, well, current as of that time. And so I was able to do a radius search of the nearest police station to that park. And by the grace of God, and I truly mean by the grace of God, that police station happened to know exactly who we were talking about. I don't know if that's good or bad, but in that instance, it was a good thing because I was able to hold the call until police were on scene. And then I was able to release the call knowing comfortably that somebody was there and could get the patient the help that they needed. So what does this have to do with leadership and congruence and policy and all of that? At the end of every shift as a supervisor, I had to provide a report of everything that happens. And so this particular report was very, very detailed. Okay. Now, it did not include patient information, but it did include enough information for the call center manager to be aware of what happened and address it with the account manager for that practice. So during this process of all of that was happening, I still had to take calls from other patients and other practices. Although I had another operator in a completely different site, this particular night, for whatever reason, everybody was calling, everybody was sick, everybody needed their doctor. And so in our systems, what happens is when the call queue gets beyond, let's just say 15 calls for the sake of this conversation, your screens start to flash, which indicates you need to end your call sooner because your queue is backing up. And so when the queue backs up, that means the practice phones start ringing a lot more. Sometimes it's the patients hanging up and calling back. Sometimes it's literally more calls coming in. So I would have to transfer the patient from the recorded line, which was connected to the systems that flash, to our back line, which meant I had to hold the call on the back line while also taking the calls of other incoming practices and their patients. And so how I did this was every time I had to transfer that patient's call to the back line, I would warn them ahead of time, your call is being transferred. Bear with me for a second, I have other calls coming in, but keep talking, I'm listening. So on one hand, I have my headset on taking these calls from these patients, and I have the receiver ear to shoulder. And I'm communicating with patients who are coming in the call that, hey, listen, I have an emergency. Please just give me the basic, most important information from your name, contact information, all the way down to what the problem is, and I will patch the call, or I will page to the doctor, depending on what the practice's instructions were. And so this worked. It allowed me to get the call queues down and still, offload most of the calls to the other center while still managing this call. That's a lot. And this is important because at that time, I was only 2 years in to healthcare. And yeah, when you're like 2 years in and how are you a supervisor? Child, that's another story for a whole nother day. But just know my manager saw something in me, and obviously it was something good because of where I am today. But child, it was a lot. That was a lot. But the saving grace that I had at that time was earlier that morning, I had just had my critical thinking class. And the topic of that class was about thinking outside the box to resolve the problems. Okay. So when I'm providing this detailed report and I am talking about how everything that happens, it sparked a conversation with the manager and the account manager. And the conversation at first started off with the account saying, hey, we're going to close our account because you didn't follow protocol. And so when the manager questioned me on why there were only a certain number of calls on the recorded line, and I couldn't really account for the 2 hours and 45 minutes, I had to explain that when the call queues got beyond what they were supposed to be, I had to transfer the patient to the back line, which prompted her to go into Comcast and pull the phone records and see that I was actually holding those calls on the back line, which made sense as to why she saw transfer numbers. So again, I explained this. Mind you, I didn't know that the practice was on speaker. And I had to basically re-explain why I did everything I did. And it really boiled down to there was no protocol for what happens in an emergency situation. So I had to think outside the box, based off how I've seen other managers respond in a critical situation. But B, I also had to think on my toes because the manager of the call center wasn't answering. I was the highest level of supervisory in the building. And then in addition to that, there's nothing in the protocol for what to do in emergency situation. So pretty much this practice left us blind. So if it had been anyone else, I pray that nobody under my leadership would have just hung up. But the likelihood of people just being like, I don't have time for this, I don't want to deal with this, or I'm not going to deal with this is very real. And then that liability would have been on our center, because if you just hung up and there's no instruction and you don't have the patience or the wherewithal, then of course that's likely to happen. But because I took the time to hold the call and think outside the box, it actually saved my center, and it saved it in a major way, not just from not losing the account, but also from a legal aspect. It saved my center. So it forced leadership to have to think about, when they're doing intakes of new accounts and people wanting to hire an answering service, it forced them to say, okay, what types of emergencies is the practice likely to experience, and how do you want us as an answering service to respond to those emergencies, and how do you want us to hold you accountable when you and your staff don't comply with your own protocol. And so when we think about having congruent businesses and making sure that things are aligned, we have to look at how our policies, our standard operating procedures, also known as SOPs, fall into place. We have to look at how those people, the people we hire, respond to those SOPs, right? That, are they following it? Are they not? We have to look at the structures we're building and how those structures align with our standard operating procedures and what we're looking to do, and how we're looking to grow. And we have to make sure that the culture we're creating is one that supports and not blames. We have to be willing to assess the risk, to look at all the potential threats of the business, or all the potential threats of a policy, or all the potential threats of the structure, or all of the potential threats that our employees and contractors face, and all the potential threats that could hinder the cultural experience. And when we don't, we run into issues that are often resulting in incongruence. Another example of that would be a situation where communication is not clear. So in our article on LinkedIn, it was called "From Clinicians to Entrepreneurs: Building a Healthy Team and Sustainable Practice." And in that article, I reference the importance of understanding the connection between SDOH and CDOH. So for those who don't know, SDOH is a public health framework for understanding social determinants of health. And basically it has several categories. It has environment, it has economic, educational access, healthcare access, economic impact from income, low income, poverty. And then I think there's another component for the justice system. Don't quote me on that. But those are like the main components, and how each of those determinants can have an impact on a patient's life. So I take that and I create a parallel to CDOH. Okay. So in this instance, if I have a administrator, let's just say the intake coordinator, who is experiencing, let's say, lack of access to mental health care. They've been struggling even with their benefits. They're struggling to find a therapist. And the intake coordinator is dealing with patients who are screaming and yelling and upset and frustrated with the process and the long wait times. There's a risk there. And as much as we tell people it's important to remain professional, in everything that they do, because it is. We also have to take into consideration that if there's a barrier in their personal life, even though we tell them chuck it at the door, the likelihood is that operating in their position is likely to cause a trigger if if the situation they're dealing with personally is not addressed, but most importantly, the situation internally in their job doesn't create an environment that can reduce triggers. So, for example, if they're struggling to access care, but they're getting screamed at by a patient who's upset that they didn't get called 3 days after the fact, and they're thinking to themselves, well, at least I called you back. I'm dealing with practices that don't call me back. Now you got to deal with how they're going to respond in the working dynamic. So then we take in that article the CDOH component and we create a parallel to congruence and incongruence. And what we are trying to highlight is that personal attributes, external attributes that have nothing to do with the job can affect the job. And then the job at hand can affect how the operations goes. So in this example, I want you to consider the intake coordinator doesn't handle the phone tree. You have medical secretaries or receptionists that take the brunt of the calls. And so the intake coordinator goes to the receptionist and they're trying to understand why they never got a message about this patient who claims that they've been calling and haven't received a call back. And now they're communicating in a way that is being received as disrespectful, although they're intending to be firm in their approach. They're intending to let them know that this was not okay, that any call related to intake must go to intake. And you might have two separate responses. So in this example, we'll say that one of the phone receptionists kind of portrays this I don't care type of attitude, or you're not my boss type of attitude. And another administrator portrays an understanding that, they may have dropped the ball, but, let's explore what happened. Okay. You have two separate receptionists, two very different perceptions of what's being communicated, and two different responses back to the sender. Okay. On one hand, Administrator A, who takes the I don't care approach, is now looking at the intake coordinator sideways, and their nonverbal cues are indicating you might want to back up. The intake coordinator, is receiving that as threatening behavior or threatening body language or intimidation or trying to make them feel unsafe. But that's not the message that the administrator intended to communicate. With Administrator B is very open, very loving, very understanding, very compassionate, knows you're just going through a hard time and understands that they dropped the ball and is willing to work with you to get to the root problem. So on one hand, the intake coordinator has created a deeper relationship or has really feels like they've been heard. But on the other hand, with the other administrator, they feel unsafe. And now there's a working dynamic that has a friction. And it's not necessarily a system issue, although there might be other problems, but it's a personnel issue. It's an interpersonal issue that was triggered by a behavior that a patient had displayed. But because the feelings, the emotions were triggered in that moment, and how they conveyed it to the other administrators was by one taken in the wrong way, now it looks like the intake coordinator is the one at fault. In that example, there's a partial responsibility. They were at fault for how they communicated it, but the receiving person is also at fault for how they communicated back. Most times in that kind of situation, it would be the intake coordinator who would take the blunt of the blame because of how they originally communicated it. But as leaders, it's our job to get to the root And so if we don't know early on that there was an issue with this person getting access to mental health care, then we couldn't support them, meaning we couldn't refer them, or meaning that we couldn't help eliminate and do more check-ins and be a support to them and plan for if there should ever be a friction as it relates to their job. And I know that for many, they don't think that they have to do this. Business is business. You come in, you do your job, you leave. But where you are a healthcare business entity, your approach has to be different, especially if you're going into other businesses and you are training other businesses on wellness focused practices or trauma informed practices, but then not cultivating those same lessons internally at your practice. It's important that you understand your personnel's barriers so that you can plan business wise. Because when you don't understand your personnel's barriers, then you can't properly plan for the disruptions. So, for example, I hire a lot of interns. It's important to me, not just from a cost perspective, because I'll be honest with you, fully transparent, I will hire both experienced and inexperienced people because I want a balance and I want inexperienced people to learn from those who are experienced in the field and learn at our level, right? Know and understand why we make the moves that we make and the decisions that we make. Because how I was trained coming up, while I did have access, I told y'all my second year in healthcare, I was a supervisor. I also worked other places that didn't value the skills and the way that I learned. And in many ways tried to actually hold me back. It was when I got around other leaders and external environments that I was able to hone in on skills and advance a lot quicker because of the people I had around me, those who are more knowledgeable. If you've ever been around a CEO that they are the smartest person in the room, run for your life. You want to be around people who are smarter than you, who have more wisdom or more experience, because they're the ones that are going to give you the knowledge that you need to be successful so that you can give it to somebody else. So to kind of come back, my intern, when I first hired her the first year, I asked her, are there any barriers that would cause you not to be able to perform your job to the best of your abilities? And she said to me, yes. She was shocked that I even asked her that question, but she also was appreciative that I took the time to ask her that question. She told me that she was dealing with an issue from the school and that the school would essentially pay for her to work for me. But because of how everything unfolded with the school and another placement that she had, she was at risk of not being able to perform her job. And so, because I have experience with the financial aid department at my school, I understood some of the tricks and tips that they were doing with her. And so I went to first I went to her direct financial aid counselor and I advocated. They told me I had to fill out this form. Once I did that, she would be all set. So I filled out the form, got it back to them same day. And as far as I knew, she was all set. A week passes by. She comes back and she says, I still haven't heard anything. I followed up with the director. No, I followed up with the financial aid counselor at this time. And again, I didn't get a response. So I waited a few days and then I reached out to the director. And then the director got involved, said that they would look into it, would get back to me. I probably played this game with the director for about a month before I escalated it to the dean. And once I had escalated it to the dean, all of a sudden there was movement. And I had explained that this wasn't just impacting the student, it was now impacting my business. And while I had found workarounds to be able to support the student and still give them the learning experience that they needed, that hands-on experience, that they were actually causing a disruption because I had to change the learning path and readjust it based off what the student was dealing with. And so they stepped into action. They got the student the money. I say that next month, maybe about the second week into that next month, the student had a deposit of that money. Now, it's not my job to call the financial aid office, and it's certainly not in my responsibilities. But one thing I knew is that if I wanted the student to be a part of the team, if I wanted the student to grow and to be effective in their role, that because I have experience with the exact same thing that the student was going through, I was willing to make a call on their behalf, business to university, and be able to see if I can help influence and move this thing forward for that student. And because I was able to do that, not only did I build a relationship with the school, but I also was able to rehire that student the following year. The student not only came, but brought others to help in the development of my organization. So when we talk about removing barriers for your employees and contractors, we're not necessarily talking about, you know, having to live their life for them, but finding ways to support them so that the operations internally doesn't get affected. Now, many would have said in that kind of situation, when she shared the barrier that she would have to performing her job, that they just wouldn't have hired her. And that is a good approach for some, but it's also a bad approach. And it's a bad approach because it doesn't matter whether you hired an intern or somebody else. At some point, your personnel is going to go through things in life. And if you don't have the ability to be flexible or to adjust or to provide accommodations or to support them, you're going to see the effect in your business. And so being aware of the barriers doesn't necessarily mean fix the problem. Being aware of the barriers just means you have resources on hand to support your employees and contractors. It means that you can provide referrals. It means that you develop partnerships and relationships with external entities that may be able to help them in different circumstances. But most importantly, it allows you to plan for when there's trouble amongst team members. It allows you to plan when they're slower in producing their work, or when um, someone has to take a leave of absence and you need work performed. You're able to get a temporary candidate in the door because you have a relationship with a staffing agency, or you're able to hire a billing company to come in when your biller ups and leaves you because you have a relationship with the HMBA, or you have having a relationship with someone who consults in revenue cycle management and is familiar with other billers. That's a part of building your overall strategy and remaining congruent, because you're preventing misalignment in different areas of your business by not only being connected, but also by being proactive and making sure that you are staying on top of what's happening in your business at all times. Because without the success of your people, how can you be a success to your patients? And let me tell you how that affects your patients in that kind of scenario with the intern. If the intern wasn't able to start and do their position, we would have had longer call times with the work that we were doing. So my particular company is structured to be an outsourced agency. We are partners with our clients. We are an extension of our clients. And so where we were having with one particular client that I'm thinking of, we probably got 70 calls a day give or take. I would have to go back and look at the records that we have internally, but we dealt with large call volumes. And so this particular intern was focused on analytics and focus on understanding the data and being able to take that data and make business decisions from it. So we had her in an intake role because we wanted the intern to see the amount of calls that we get during the day, to be able to go back and look at the reports from both the phone system as well as the reports from the EHR system that we use. And then we worked with the intern to teach them how to determine if we need improvements in this area. So one of the things that the intern was able to uncover is that when this particular client would get phone calls, the way that their phone tree was initially set up is that everybody could be on a call and the phone system would buzz. It would buzz the person's phone line. So if you selected option 1 in the queue and you got intake in option 1, what would happen if intake is on the phone, their line is going to beep continuously until the call is answered. It was the most annoying thing ever. But the way that we redesigned the phone system is that if the first queue that you go into does not answer, you're immediately prompted to leave a voicemail. And then the voicemail prompt says, hey, well, not exactly hey, but you know what I'm trying to say. It gives them instructions for if we're currently on the other line, if you don't receive a call back within the hour, please call us back. That's voicemail prompt number 1. The main voicemail prompt was directing people to leave a message and we'll call them back within 24 to 48 hours. So having that intern there to teach them about the phone trees and learning the phone trees and understanding the call volumes in the intake role gave her an experience on another level to see the problems that the front end was experiencing. By readdressing the phone keys, our intern was able to help us help our client think of the patient experience and what patients are feeling when they're calling and the calls just keep beeping and beeping and beeping and beeping and beeping. It also triggered a thought of when I used to work for this other practice. This particular practice wasn't necessarily a startup, but they had just bought an existing practice. The doctor was retiring. And during that transition, the doctor was frustrated because the patients that he had taken over were inundating the phone lines with calls. And they would get really frustrated when nobody would answer or they wouldn't answer in a timely manner. And so thinking about that experience and how it impacted the patients and the doctor, it allowed our agency to go back to this client and say, hey, listen, based off these findings, we recommend that you look at a phone tree that supports the volume of calls that you're experiencing and update your SOPs to reflect what to do when you've been on a long call and you have all these calls in queue and how quickly those calls get addressed or the manner in which those calls get addressed. That might mean look like separating roles, having primary duties and then secondary duties, and using the team members to support one another when it comes to call management. If we aren't able as leaders to look at these problems and find a workaround or a solution, we create incongruence because the problem remains and it doesn't get addressed. And so a part of being able to have a healthy practice, a sustainable practice, and most importantly, a well-driven team is making sure you are reducing the stressors that your team has to experience. And a part of doing that is making sure that you're constantly improving your processes, constantly auditing the plans that you've developed over the years, over the year, making sure that the current plan fits how you've grown and or where you're growing to. If that means changing out your EHR system or changing out your phone system, then that's what you have to do. That is how you have successful practices. It's not from leaving things undone and then just letting people leave. I can't tell you how many times I've encountered leaders who have heard the problems of their employees and their contractors and have ignored it. And then when they left or the practice had such a high turnover, they still had this I don't care type of behavior until they had to hire HR consultants to come in and explain to them the very thing that people said they had a problem with culture wise, leadership wise, operationally wise, is the very reason that they have this high turnover and poor reputation to the point that people don't want to work for them. I can even personally attest to times where I have gone and I've researched a company and I've looked at the lens of the employees and what they dealt with and have had to determine with discernment whether or not that was a company I wanted to work for. And I can tell you, there were a lot of companies, brand wise, their name was recognizable and many people loved them. But personnel wise, based off the reviews and how the company would respond, would often lead me to apply other places. I can recall this one review where this employee talked about how the team dynamics were poor and how leadership never got to the root of the issues that the teams had. They talked about the benefits, they talked about the pay, they talked about how they loved their job, but their cons were the environment. And nowadays, you have more people looking for healthy, wellness centered organizations that provide respect and cultural competence than they are pay and benefits. Imagine that. Imagine how many people are taking a step back and saying, I don't want to work for a company that is more business function and revenue driven than a company that focuses on making sure I have what I need so I can produce what they need. Just think, just 10, even 20 years ago, that wasn't a conversation, or at least it wasn't a conversation that made public eye, public view. And so, as we wrap up today's episode, I want you to think about how you are stewarding a healthy business. I want you to think about areas in your business right now that you can firmly say are aligned, and then areas of your business where you believe it could use some improvement. And if you're not already doing this, go visit us on LinkedIn. Go to type in From Clinician to Entrepreneur newsletter and follow us. The link will also be in the show notes. And engage with us in the comment section of each article. Every article will encompass a themed educational topic that is relating to the podcast. And then on its off weeks, we will talk about consulting and revenue cycle and we'll give you business insights into what's happening externally so you guys can plan for it and prepare things internally. And make sure you let us know about the content that we're delivering, how it's helping you, what else you want us to talk about. Because baby, when I tell you over these next few months, we're going to go deep in this leadership conversation, and we're going to make sure we're driving in on being more proactive in how we build behavioral health practices. Next week's news article is what is consulting and how do I find the right consultant? And the next podcast episode is Leading the People. Y'all, I'm so excited for it. I think I'm more excited than you are. But stay tuned for more information. And again, as always, don't hesitate to visit us on our website, www.jlwmedicalmanagementconsulting, to learn more about our consulting services and how we can support you in business. We'll see you next time.
Well, friends, that's our time. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. This podcast is sponsored by JLW Medical Management Consulting. We are now accepting applications for the Patient Referral Program and the 90-day Private Practice Bootcamp. If you would like to learn more, please visit us online at www.jlwmedicalmh.com. We look forward to seeing you next time.